And good afternoon. My name is Derek Olson, and this is World Oregon's webinar, part of our Global Conversations series that we're having today is on Pakistan and American diplomacy, insights from 9/11 to the Afghanistan Endgame with expert and my good friend, Ted Craig, and I'll be giving him introduction in just a minute or two. Just a few general points. We're wonderful to have you join us today. And look forward to seeing you at future events. I'm going to post here in the chat. We have our upcoming International Speaker Series talks coming up on June 5th with the noted author John Green speaking about A World Without Tuberculosis, and made famous by the movie Hotel Rwanda, Paul Rusesabagina speaking about reconciling the unimaginable. And those are some really should be inspiring events. They're going to be at Revolution Hall. And I'm posting here in the chat the link where you can get tickets to those. Again, that's June 5th and June 10th, 7 o'clock at Revolution Hall. They're not streaming, but there are a recorded option for anyone who buys the ticket. So even if you can't come in person, I encourage you to buy a ticket and watch it afterwards. I also want to give a shout out to our partner, Broadway Books, who always partners when we have authors. And a case in point here today, there's a link here in the chat, how to buy Ted's book, Pakistan and American Diplomacy, through our independent bookstore partner, Broadway Books. Of course, you can also get it from other fine venues, but we'd like to support our partner here locally at Broadway Books. And again, thank you to all those who are members or donors of World Oregon. These webinars are only possible with your support, and I'm going to post our donate page on the web there for folks interested. And now to today's talk. I'm going to post the information. You can see his full bio. Ted Craig is a counterterrorism expert and career diplomat. Retired from the Foreign Service in late 2020 after almost 30-year career as a political officer, serving abroad in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And in March 2023, he began work as a senior advisor on U.S.-funded counterterrorism programs for the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Counterterrorism, based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. He's just wrapped up a couple years there, and previous to that, he served 2 tours of the U.S. In the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad, first as deputy political counselor, and then as political counselor. Key momentous years in U.S. Pakistan relations, and those contributed significantly to the narrative in his book. It's Pakistan and American Diplomacy, Insights from 9/11 to the Afghanistan Endgame, just hot off the press this year. He's also spent time working on Pakistan as a deputy director in the Office of Terrorism, Narcotics, and Crime Analysis in the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. And again, later as a terrorism analyst in the late 2010s, early 2020s. Originally from Kansas, Ted holds a BA from Colorado College and a master's from Johns Hopkins renowned School of Advanced International Studies. And as I mentioned, Ted and I are old friends. We had our first foreign service tour together in Guatemala, these many years ago, and then served again later in Bolivia together. And I can tell you he's an outstanding writer and just a very sharp and humble and just engaging person. And so we're thrilled to have him join us remotely for this webinar. And he's in between postings. He might talk a little bit later about what he's doing on that. But first, we're going to give him a chance to talk a little bit about some of the key themes coming from his book. And then we'll have some Q&A with me, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to Ted.
Thank you, Derek. And thank you, everyone participating. Derek and I do go way back, and I want to thank him for almost 30 years of friendship, for being a great colleague, and I learned a lot from him in tours in both Guatemala and La Paz, and we've stayed in touch over the years. Also appreciate this chance to engage with Oregon. I'm actually employed by an Oregon company, Cayuse Technologies, out of Pendleton. They run a contract with the State Department's Counterterrorism Bureau. And they supported me in my deployment to Dhaka, and now my upcoming deployment as counterterrorism advisor for CT programs in Central Asia. based in Uzbekistan. So that's my next adventure. Again, thank you all. I've had some great discussions here in Washington around the issues of how we engage with Pakistan, Afghanistan after the American withdrawal, and with Pakistan after some momentous changes there. And I want to get to the questions and answers very quickly. But let me tell you just a few things about the book, and then maybe throw out a couple of its most provocative conclusions to spark conversation. The book itself is a bit unconventional. It's a book about U.S. diplomacy. It's a book about geopolitics in South Asia, but it is also a book about the sport of cricket. For years, the working title of this book was Reverse Spin, which is a technique of bowling or pitching in cricket that was perfected by world famous cricketer Imran Khan, who had just become prime minister, or was in the process of becoming prime minister of Pakistan when I arrived in Pakistan for my second tour. It's a way to bowl the ball where it spins in the opposite direction of what's expected by the batter. I liked the title Reverse Spin because it suggested the way things always go sideways in U.S. Pakistan relations. But probably wisely, the publisher and my agent decided on something a little more straightforward, Pakistan and American diplomacy. But there is a lot of cricket in it. I found it an interesting way to illuminate the perspectives of different countries in the region, Pakistan's closest neighbors. In the 2019 World Cup, which is I treat in this book, that is the World Cup of cricket, there were 10 countries participating. 5 of them were from South Asia, including Pakistan's tense neighbors, India and Afghanistan, and its old eastern half, Bangladesh. So quite interesting relationships, sort of illuminated by the game. And you can learn more about the sport and why I think it's important in politics if you read the book. The other thing, just for those of you aspiring to write, that I found convenient about picking up cricket is I knew as I finished my second tour in Pakistan, we had been through some very momentous things, the beginning of the negotiations that led to our pullout from Afghanistan, the raid on Abbottabad that killed Osama bin Laden, other events that happened during my tours there. I knew I wanted to write about it, but there are a lot of really big, clunky books about U.S.-Pakistan relations, and I didn't want to write one of those. Some of them are very good. I'm not meaning to disparage them, but it's hard to imagine. It was hard for me to imagine writing one straight through. The advantage of the cricket structure is I arranged the core of the book, chapters 4 through 12, around Pakistan's progressive matches in the World Cup of cricket, and then built out themes that were important in each of those relations. The advantage of that structure for the reader is that you don't have to read this book straight through. I'd encourage you to, but you don't have to. If you want to find out, if you want to consider the diplomacy that led to our departure from Afghanistan and all the troubles we had in our Afghanistan security policy for 20 years before our departure, you can go to chapter 11 on the Pakistan-Afghanistan cricket match. Most of it's about the politics, but a little bit is about the cricket. If you want to hear about our engagement with Pakistan and India as they pursued their troubled relations over the years, you go to chapter 8 on the India-Pakistan match. So it provided me a nice way to write the book and a good way to organize it, I think, effectively. And it's also kind of fun to add sports to politics. So I'm happy to discuss that process in more detail, the publishing process for any of you who are interested. Derek and I have also discussed when we get to Q&As, happy to talk about careers. I went through a full foreign service career and then turned to other things after, but I'm still working in embassies and finding it quite interesting and challenging and still very important. So I'm going to read just 3 passages from the book to sort of start conversations. The first is sort of the overall theory, I guess you would say, of the book, and that is that both Pakistan and the United States, particularly in dealing with Afghanistan, but also overall in their relationship, were often harmed by commitment on both sides to really hard views of their interests, but I would also call them, and I do call them, ideologies. They had moved beyond a rational view of interest and into something that both states viewed as something they just could not depart from. So as I write in the book, in its most pervasive manifestation, In the U.S. Pakistan relationship of the early 21st century, the controlling ideology was the Pakistan security establishment's idea that its interests in Afghanistan could best be supported by protecting the Afghan Taliban. This undercut the West's efforts to remake that country. It was a strategy, but the establishment's commitment to it, despite the damage to Pakistan's national interests, damage that Pakistan is still suffering today, gave it the cast of an ideology. It was a first rational and then a product of groupthink. The other controlling ideology from Pakistan is its commitment to the idea that as the home to South Asia's Muslims, it has had to maintain a constant effort to free those Muslims in India-controlled Kashmir from India government. Even at a cost of many wars, at a cost of frozen relations with the biggest economic power right on its border, and at the cost of supporting militancy both at home and abroad. Again, this one is an ideology that to some extent was accepted by the Pakistani people, not just by the army, but definitely ideological in the way it sways decisions. So for the United States, I would also say there were some ideological commitments. One of them is the idea that we have the power and influence to change how foreign countries are governed through sanctions, democracy assistance programs, and sometimes through the application of military power. A corollary to this was Washington's idea that the electoral votes received by Presidents Karzai and then Ghani in Afghanistan, however muddied they were by irregularities, gave them an authority to rule Afghanistan that the Taliban needed to heed in the negotiations. Another institutional ideology on our part was our exaggerated counterterrorism posturing. Seemingly anyone in Washington could stop a nascent effort to negotiate with the Taliban or others by saying, we don't do deals with terrorists, and then we would walk away from those talks. Eventually, under Presidents Obama and then Trump, we did move forward with negotiations. So that's, I guess, the structure, the thematic structure argument of the book. Two provocations that I'll mention before we get to the questions and answers. The first is, again, related to this idea that America can and should push foreign governments toward democracy. I encountered this when I arrived from my second tour in Pakistan as political counselor in July of 2018. At the time, Imran Khan, the cricketer, was forming a government. He had just enough support in parliament to form that government. Washington, specifically the State Department, was initially quite skeptical of his democratic win, and for good reason, because the Pakistan deep state, the military, had aided Imran Khan's party significantly, including pursuing one-sided corruption investigations against the then ruling party, the PMLN, manipulating the press, pressuring locally important politicians to join Imran Khan's coalition, and a variety of even more unsavory mechanisms. So Imran Khan was the first time around pushed toward power by the Pakistan military that wanted an alternative to the old parties. As I write in the book, this was the puzzle our embassy faced at the time of my arrival. Boiled down, Imran Khan's victory was built on equal parts chicanery and genuine support. He had a lot of true believers among the youth in Pakistan, among the middle class in Pakistan, who really did believe he could prevent an alternative. As I described the decisions, we in the embassy encouraged Washington to let us go visit the presumptive prime minister, whatever concerns we had about the election. We knew he would lead the next government. We knew the military was behind him. I note that we had significant reasons to maintain a good relationship with that military establishment, particularly the fact that the Trump administration then wanted to start negotiations towards an agreement with the Taliban, and Pakistan was significantly influential with the Taliban. Those considerations notwithstanding, however, I think any effort on our part to delegitimize Imran Khan's victory in 2018 would have been disastrous. He did have genuine support. Moreover, the opposition had conceded defeat almost immediately. There was no movement in Pakistan to support a press for a more democratic outcome. And as I write in the book, we really, while we can sometimes help at the margins and support those fighting for democracy in countries, we can't and shouldn't try to force that issue on our own in foreign political systems. It almost never works. It didn't work very well when we were briefly the world's sole superpower, and it certainly won't work well now when in this multipolar world when Pakistan in particular has significant support from China above all other of its patrons, more so than even our influence. So we just saw another version of this story. In February this year, Pakistan had another general election. This time, the Pakistan military was tired of Imran Khan, and they used all those same tricks to support the old PMLN party and make sure Khan didn't win. Against the script, Khan's PTI did quite well in the election, delivering a rebuke to the military establishment in Pakistan. Khan's supporters argue that their strong showing, despite all the pressures of the military, indicates that they would have won a free and fair election. That may well be true. Again, however, my belief is the United States did not have the means or perhaps the interest to object to the outcome. Again, Pakistan has long relied on China as its foremost international partner, and China was not going to punish the government and the military for this lapse in democracy. I had a related experience with it, which I'm happy to discuss in the questions and answers. I was serving in Dhaka, and they had a national election in January this year. Those of you who might have followed it know that, again, the United States pressed pretty hard in this case on the ruling party to make for a more democratic electoral process. We were largely rebuffed. We were frustrated. The ruling party, I mean, we're not opposed to them winning the election. We just wanted a more free and fair election. They won an election that was demonstrably tilted in their favor. Again, it was out of our power, so far away, and with China, and in this case, particularly India, playing a big role in the country to really change that outcome. So I should say, despite these cautions around democracy promotion, I am in favor of programs that support democracy. We can give aid to free press, we can give aid to human rights advocates, we can provide support for making better judicial systems in these countries. All of those can be very important. But I am expressing a lot of caution over the wisdom of the United States using its full power and influence to demand countries adopt a certain approach to governance. So one last provocation, and then we'll get to the questions and answers, and that is about Afghanistan. As I say, when I arrived for my second tour, we spent a significant amount of time in my political section supporting the nascent negotiations by Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad. Those negotiations with the Taliban began in Pakistan. A not very well kept secret was that the Pakistan intelligence agency supported the presence in Pakistan of the Taliban leadership through the years of our conflict in Afghanistan. They were willing to help us start those negotiations. Those negotiations ultimately moved to Doha, where the process of working out the ultimate agreement between the United States and Taliban under the Trump administration was worked out. I'm going to read just two quick, brief passages related to those negotiations. I say that the process of overcoming red lines was at the heart of Khalilzad's diplomacy. And by those red lines, I mean in particular the Taliban's insistence that it would not negotiate with the Afghanistan government, that it would only negotiate with us. They viewed the Afghan government as a product of our intervention, not very powerful, not legitimate, and insisted they would only negotiate with us. Khalilzad's approach amounted to continuously nudging the Taliban toward contact with the government in Kabul, even as the U.S. troops remained in the country. There were false starts, including attempted proximity meetings with the Taliban, but ultimately the demonstrable intent of President Trump to quit Afghanistan persuaded the Taliban to give a little, and they found their way to joining minor talks with the Afghan government. Khalilzad could take credit for getting the Taliban past the red line while U.S. troops are still in the country. This proved not enough, however, as there was no way to enforce Taliban sincerity or compromise in this intra-Afghan dialogue. It may be that years of U.S. diplomacy focused on getting the Taliban into a dialogue with the government had exhausted all of our creativity and leverage. We got the Taliban to a starting point, not the end point, and then we agreed to leave, which was reasonable if we assumed the Afghan army and government possessed the will and capability to fight long enough to induce the Taliban to negotiate a final settlement. Instead, both institutions collapsed as U.S. forces departed. It was a bad outcome by any perspective, and yet the other argument I make in the book that we can discuss further is the argument that it was the right decision. And I want to mention one thing because we've seen it in the press a lot. I think it was the inevitable decision. We had other bigger foreign policy concerns in other parts of the world and could no longer sustain the drain of our presence in Afghanistan, particularly as there was no indication that the government or the Afghan army was moving in the right direction. So the issue in the press right now is often this question of why didn't we keep some military presence in Kabul after our withdrawal? I say in the book, as we considered the emerging Taliban deal in U.S. government circles, including during my time in the embassy, there was a bit of magical thinking about how the Taliban might allow the United States to keep a military presence in Kabul, a force that would have a strictly counterterrorism mission, probably against the emergent group ISIS. After withdrawal, critics made much of the Defense Department's odd advocacy for this outcome, as if President Biden and his team simply failed to follow up on a bright idea. It was never viable. I saw nothing to suggest the Taliban would permit the United States to maintain such a role after they took power. And to maintain 2,500 counterterrorism operators in Kabul against the wishes of the Taliban, we would have needed 10 or 20,000 more troops to protect them. For the Taliban, it would have been an end to the agreement. We would have taken casualties and the war would have continued. The dispiriting outcome in Kabul in August 21 was both inevitable because we could not win and a choice because we were exhausted. But there was no easy option left unexplored by the Trump or Biden administrations. I will say, I know many will disagree with this conclusion that it was time to leave Afghanistan. And I very much welcome that discussion, and I admit to doubts about this conclusion. It is gut-wrenching to see the people of Afghanistan subjected to Taliban governance today. But ultimately, from a perspective of U.S. interests overseas, I do think it was the right decision. I should say there's a lot of discussion in Washington right now. I was just at one yesterday at the U.S. Institute of Peace on how we structure our engagement with the government of Pakistan in this post-Taliban or post-withdrawal era, how we deal with terrorism threats still emanating from Afghanistan. And I would like to discuss those in the question and answers. I'm going to put a link to an article in the chat that I wrote. I probably shouldn't. I hope you all buy the book, but it's a much shorter read for those of you who are interested. I will say the conclusion of my book is that despite the grave disappointment that many in Washington, those who served in Afghanistan, those policymakers who confronted Pakistan as supported the Taliban for all these years, despite the many frustrations and legitimate grievances we feel towards Pakistan for its role, I think we have a strong national interest in continuing to engage there. And from all signals we're seeing from Pakistan these days, the door is open to more engagement. I think Pakistan from 2000 to 2021, we put way too much onto a relationship that couldn't really take it. It's a much smaller relationship now. We're not putting as much money into the country. We're not dependent on them for getting our supplies into our troops in Afghanistan the way we formerly were. But that lower level of relationship can be a positive one. And I think there are important objectives we share with Pakistan, particularly in the counterterrorism realm in the region. And I strongly advocate in the book continuing to engage. And I would say the U.S. IP study, which went up online yesterday. That may be impossible to show on the screen, but it's the senior study group on counterterrorism in Afghanistan and Pakistan reaches the same conclusion that despite a lot of, General Nagata, one of the speakers yesterday, described it as trauma in U.S. policy making circles over Pakistan. His recommendation as well is that we have a lot to gain from engagement with the country. So I've thrown out a couple of ideas that we can discuss in the Q&A, but again, I welcome questions about my current work, about careers in diplomacy, and about other aspects of our engagement over the past 20 years with South Asia, including the relationship with India, which is obviously quite important to U.S. foreign policy right now in our Indo-Pacific strategy. So I'll close there and look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, Ted. Really appreciate that overview of key points in your book. Encourage people, again, there's a link in the chat, which I'll post again, to Broadway Books, where you can buy the book, and Ted's going to be posting a link to the article. I also just posted in the chat the U.S. Institute of Peace link to just hot off their press that Ted was just mentioning. Going to go to one of the questions from the audience. From our partners at Portland State University. Recently, we've seen some countries become more aligned with China. Is Pakistan moving in that direction? And if so, how will that impact our future relations with Pakistan?
It's a great question, and one we faced every day while I served in Pakistan. In fact, I devote a chapter of the book. Doesn't fit in the World Cup structure, cricket World Cup structure, because neither the United States nor China are particular powers in the world of cricket. So it's chapter 3, and it's basically Pakistan's very successful, I think, effort to balance its two most important patrons, and those are the United States and China. China's influence in Pakistan is more significant than you'd find in most countries. In some points of view, Pakistan is China's only significant, almost ally in the world. China dominates military sales to Pakistan. Pakistan is the most important country in the Belt and Road Initiative of China. They have the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor project, which has built roads across Balochistan, and they're developing out a port in Gwadar, which sits very close to the Persian Gulf. It doesn't make much economic sense, but there's a lot of Chinese money going in there. A lot of Chinese workers in the country. So China's influence is significant. That said, and from a perspective of sustaining our influence in the region, even Pakistan, which has had to lean heavily towards China, is not interested in being fully dependent on one patron, on one foreign power. It wants, and we're seeing this more recently, it wants us to remain, the United States and the West in general, to remain engaged. It wants alternatives to Chinese weaponry if we're willing to sell to them. It wants our trade and investment. We're a very important market for Chinese products. So I think we're seeing this in the region I'm going to as well, and I'll mention that Central Asia, those countries have significant influence from Russia based on their history in the Soviet Union. They have significant new influence from China nearby, putting economic investments into the region. But even all of those countries very much want to maintain their freedom of movement in geopolitics. And in many areas, they too have invited the United States to come in. So I think we can lament that in some senses, China's influence can be deleterious for things like human rights in some of the countries it engages in. In almost all instances, countries don't want to have to sell out fully to Beijing or to Moscow or to another country. And we do have room for maneuver. And very much in the case of Pakistan, I make the case that we should stay engaged.
So following on from that, Ted, we've done some programs here about the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or known as the Quad, for those who aren't familiar, with Australia, India, Japan, the United States. Now, my understanding that's more designed around China and China's influence in the region. I'm wondering how Pakistan views that, since links up India, which of course is a longtime rival of Pakistan.
Yeah, I think the Quad is probably relatively problematic for Pakistan, in one sense because it highlights the emerging U.S. strategic, as you said, Derek, the U.S. strategic relationship with India, a longtime rival of Pakistan, but also because it's, clearly directed towards checking China's expansion of interest in the Indo-Pacific region. And while Pakistan is not necessarily, an advocate for expanded Chinese influence, they are dependent on China, so can't really hook their foreign policy to anything that challenges by Beijing so implicitly or explicitly as does the Quad. Pakistan wants good relationships with India is more problematic, and we can talk about that relationship, but they certainly want good relations with Australia, the U.S., Japan, and Europe also. So I don't think they're overwrought by the Quad, but it's nothing they're going to get behind.
Sure. I'm going to pass it to my colleague Tim, who's going to ask a question or two here.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. Great presentation. So, kind of following on that again, recent national security strategy acknowledges pretty specifically a return to great power competition, which is about, containing and constraining China and Russia. And central to that is really building and amplifying those strong alliances in the Indo-Pacific, as Derek alluded to. Are there post-counterterrorism areas we should be looking at specifically with Pakistan, like technology or education or climate or health sectors that we're not looking at?
Thanks, Tim. Absolutely. I think, the Chinese investments in Pakistan have been problematic. They invested heavily in infrastructure in Pakistan, in roads, in power, which Pakistan needed, not necessarily clean power, but a lot of power plants. But they did so with financial structures that left Pakistan quite indebted and a little bit scarred by the experience, and has put a brake to some degree on CPEC projects in phase 2. So I think there are areas of economic development, of engagement on science and technology, where Pakistan would clearly be open to our engagement. In some sense, we do financing more generously than does China, although there are things China will fund that we simply won't touch. But we have good arrangements. They would like to have more engagement with U.S. companies going forward. Pakistan is very vulnerable to some of the impacts of climate change, so is looking for help in mitigating those impacts, particularly around water issues in the Indus River basin. So I think there are a lot of really areas where we could engage quite positively. We're not going to do it on the scale we did. At the height of the Afghanistan conflict and the early Obama administrations, we channeled huge amounts of development assistance to Pakistan, along with a lot of requirements to receive that assistance, which led to some irritation in the bilateral relationship. But we tried development on a massive scale in 2010, 2011. Kerry Lugar bills financing education, a lot of sectors in Pakistan. A lot of that assistance didn't have the impact we would have liked to show our taxpayers. So I think we maybe we're not as strategic or effective as we could have been. So I think going forward, we should have a development assistance relationship with Pakistan. We do things better and more democratically than other partners that Pakistan has, and we can have a positive impact there. Our engagement also does help those in Pakistan in favor of more environmentally conscious growth, those who want to see Pakistan stay relatively democratic and respectful of human rights. Our engagement there, Europe's engagement there, has salutary impacts in a lot of policy areas for Pakistanis, and there's a lot of support outside of government as well for us staying engaged.
So,
that was that question? Sorry, I took a lot there.
No, that's all right. So not that long ago, there was a coming together of the U.S. Pakistan trade an investment framework, and they had not met in, I don't know, 6 or 7 years. So this was developed in many ways to support what you're talking about, which is, a springboard for bilateral trade and the strengthening of commercial ties. Is there any reason to believe that we're going to see stronger momentum based on their recent sort of renewal of this?
Pakistan has some deep-seated economic problems right now, including balance of payment crises, budgetary problems. Their government does not deliver, tax revenue to development, internal development very well at all. There are a lot of inefficiencies in their investment climate, things that prevent U.S. companies from trading. My 12th chapter in the book, The Last Pakistan Match, is against Bangladesh. And I make a comparison there of Pakistan and Bangladesh's growth trajectory. Bangladesh started at the time they separated from Pakistan much more poor, just suffered a devastating civil war. They had few resources, many fewer resources than Pakistan. And yet in the year 2020, Bangladesh passed Pakistan in per capita GDP. They did so by focusing heavily on an export-led economic model, particularly in ready-made garments. A lot of your shirts and socks are made in Bangladesh, and that's okay. They've done quite well with that. But I make a comparison. Pakistan has just not been consistent in its overall approach to growth and development, to its economic policies. It tried heavy state influence in the 70s, and it still hasn't sort of fully gotten away from state-controlled industries. It has a heavy military footprint to the economy. The military owns all sorts of economic ventures, from breakfast cereals to insurance to finance, and not always probably the most efficient provider, but they get advantages from the state that allow them to secure a monopoly in certain sectors. Road building is another sector where the military has a huge impact. So I'm not making light of the huge problems that Pakistan faces to get on a better economic course. And the government that emerged in February is not a strong government. As I say, the opposition, Imran Khan's party, did quite well and has really challenged the legitimacy of that outcome. So it's going to be very difficult for that government to make, the new government to make bold policy decisions that are needed if Pakistan is to really get back on an economic growth trajectory. I think we can help. I think, there are going to be discrete opportunities for U.S. trade and investment in Pakistan, but based on my experience there and comments from my learned economic colleagues dealing with Pakistan, I would not make light of the challenges.
So on the comparison contrast piece, we've got a question from the audience. What is the status of women in Pakistan in comparison with that of women in Afghanistan?
Certainly better than the status of women in the Taliban's Afghanistan. I make a comparison in the book between the policies of Pakistan and Bangladesh towards empowering women. And I would say Bangladesh, I think participation of women in the workforce, for example, is in the formal workforce. Almost all women in Bangladesh and Pakistan are working. But in the formal economy, I think the level is 36% in Bangladesh and under 30% in Pakistan. So that's millions of workers, women, that Pakistan has not fully brought into the economy. And that's due to persistent discrimination in education. It's due to more conservative social norms that prevent women from working with men in certain environments. As a diplomat serving in Islamabad, you see these really powerful and impressive Pakistani women who, don't put up with any mansplaining and are really out there being very effective leaders in thought and government and industry. But outside of Islamabad or outside of Karachi and Lahore, perhaps, you find a very different environment for women in the country, and it is an impediment to their economic growth and development going forward. But to some extent, social norms in Pakistan have grown more conservative over the past 20 years. The question about Afghanistan, I'm afraid Afghanistan's, no one happily really compares with Afghanistan right now. It's one of the worst environments for women's rights in the world. Education denied past a very low level. Women pushed out of the workforce, prevented from owning almost all types of business, required to be accompanied by men in social settings. It's from the perspective of our Western values, quite appalling and difficult to see. And a lot of women under the governments of Afghanistan for the last 20 years have enjoyed much broader rights than they do now. And it's going to be interesting to see whether the Taliban's decision to deny these rights across the board ultimately leads that regime to be unstable. It's certainly going to make it less economically effective and is already having a big impact there. But its impact on social indicators for women and children is going to be big as well.
So I'm going to lob a cricket question at you, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Derek. It is fascinating, cricket. I mean, because cricket, of course, there's no arguing that it's a byproduct of colonialism. But cricket in Pakistan often feels like a prism for politics and religion, like whether it's avenging the mistreatment of Muslims by defeating India or teaching a lesson to New Zealand for walking away from a match. Has a nationalist or Islamist focus on the sport increased their already fervent audience and support for the sport? And is there a feedback loop coming back into popular politics and elections as a result of that?
Oh, it's a great question, complex. The first part's easy to answer. Cricket, almost immediately following independence and the partition of India and Pakistan, became an important vehicle for expressing nationalism in Pakistan. There's no doubt about it. And as you allude to, matches between Pakistan and India became quite fraught affairs from the start, with a lot of tension, with riots if one team or the other didn't do well, with implications in politics for certain. There were also a lot of edgy matches between Pakistan and England, stemming from colonialism, but also sometimes slightly callous racism, whether from British fans in England in the 70s with very disparaging comments about the Pakistan visitors, or concerns in Pakistan matches that the English weren't behaving well or were complaining too much about, umpiring in the country. So that always became quite edgy in the country. And you're right, I think for all of the countries in South Asia, and then most recently for Afghanistan, cricket became an expression of national pride. Took root more slowly in places like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. Afghanistan didn't really learn cricket from the British. It learned it from the 3 million refugees who came into Pakistan in the 90s or in the 80s after the Soviet invasion. That's where Afghanistan's real commitment to the game grew up. But there are also interesting elements in cricket about, race and class, and how it grew up in the subcontinent as very exclusionary. In terms of Islam, I don't see as firm a connection there with the maybe more conservative expressions of Islam among a larger percentage of Pakistan or other populations in the region having much to do with cricket. It's almost as if support for cricket exists sort of apart from those social questions, I would say. And one more interesting observation, and this is in the book as well, is to be a member of the International Cricket Council, you have to have a women's team. That's one of the requirements. For most of the 2010s, we kind of let Afghanistan slide because as they tried to develop a women's game, it was often threatened by terrorists, and therefore they had trouble fully getting it off the ground. Now the Taliban has basically nixed women's cricket, and yet Afghanistan is still playing as a member of the International Cricket Council, still traveling abroad to matches with all the other cricketing powers. It's an interesting question. There are pluses to keeping Afghanistan engaged with the world, but there are also questions about whether, doing so at the expense of another blow to women's rights in the country is the right approach. So, yeah, cricket's at the center of so many things in the region. I loved writing about it, and thank you for the question.
Thanks, Tim. So, I mean, you have an interesting perspective, Ted, as somebody who has worked both directly for the State Department as a Foreign Service officer and then later as a contractor. And anyway, it might be somewhat limited in what you could say, but it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that, the different sort of approaches and how that's varied. And my guess is, like myself, you probably are enjoying being able to speaking a little freer than we could when we were directly government officials. But I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Derek. It's true. I am enjoying a little more freedom now, although when I'm out serving in Dhaka as I was, or Tashkent as I will be, I'm still serving under the Chief of Missions Authority. So I'm still very cognizant of the fact that I need to make sure that what I'm saying and doing has the support of our ambassador and the State Department. They are my employer still, even if it once removed. You mentioned the issue of publishing, and even though I had retired from the Foreign Service at the time that I got this book out, I was obligated to send it through clearances at the State Department. So that's an interesting aspect of publishing. I got about one full page of redactions. So those are the juicy bits that unfortunately you won't see in the book. They allowed me to keep some as long as I could find a open source for it. Sure. That it wasn't just coming from me having been in that secret meeting. And the good thing about Pakistan is there's a journalist called Steve Cole who wrote a couple of giant books about U.S. Pakistan in the era of the Afghanistan wars up to about 2016, I think the last one finishes. Anyway, everyone seemed to tell him secrets, so they're almost all in his book. So if I knew something that was kind of delicate, I could often refer to that. There is a whole world of contracting positions, not just for the Department of State, but for DoD, for USAID, for all of the U.S. agencies engaged in foreign policy and foreign development. It does give you a little more flexibility. I think to be one degree removed from the U.S. government that I do enjoy. As I say, I'm still making sure what I do aligns with the Counterterrorism Bureau and the Chief of Mission in the country. But I would say I have a little more freedom to speak, to express doubts, and to challenge. I'm no longer particularly concerned about career advancement. I have a great job, and they seem to be very happy to let me do it with some freedom. I never get reviewed really in any substantive way, which is a great change from, as you know, Derek, the annual performance reviews in the Foreign Service, which are, people spend weeks and weeks on those, concerned over particular adjectives or adverbs and how it will affect their prospects of getting promoted 3 years hence. It's nice to be outside of that hierarchy. I think the State Department bureaucracy works pretty well in a lot of ways. So I'm not just, bashing a bureaucracy. It's also nice after almost 3 decades to sort of be apart from that structure. Sure. Yeah.
Got a question coming in from the audience about Kashmir. What do you see for the future of Kashmir? I mean, obviously there's been a flashpoint between the two countries.
So since 2019, when there was a significant terrorist attack in Indian Kashmir, attributed to a Pakistan-based group, and a little conflict between the two countries that I describe in the book, including an aerial dogfight between the two countries. Pakistan has taken observable steps to limit the infiltration of fighters and weapons into Kashmir, which is not to say it's not still happening, but they certainly turned down the heat. That's one aspect of the Kashmir problem, has been Pakistan's consistent support for militancy there over the years, as causing a flashpoint between the two countries. But the other side of the coin, of course, is that arguably India has moved towards less tolerant governance in many ways in the country, with a sort of Hindu nationalist ruling ideology in the ruling party. It took away some self-governance rights in Kashmir in 2019, causing more friction between Pakistan and India. And it may be that without the Pakistan influence, there's not sufficient support in Kashmir for continued insurgency or resistance to cause real problems for Indian control there. It does seem to have gotten a little less fraught, but there's always attacks on police by probably local Kashmiris who still resist Indian rule. And I would say until there's probably some effort to address the interests of the local community, not necessarily in separation from India, but more efforts to address localized interests in a democratic way, you're probably going to continue to see trouble there. Will it continue to be the flashpoint that's caused 3 wars between India and Pakistan? I hope not. It would be, I think, useful. Pakistan is not going to seize Kashmir from India, and continuing to fight that battle particularly by supporting militancy, is only damaging to Pakistan's security interests. Some indications that maybe they've changed course, but we've seen that in the past, and it hasn't lasted. So I can't say I'm optimistic that Kashmir as a point of friction between Pakistan and India is going away soon.
So as we get short of time here, I'm going to post. Sorry there, I'm having challenges with my mic. As we get close to the end of the hour, I'm posting again the link to the University of North Carolina article, where you make some of the points that might be the precursor to someone reading the entire book. But I also love to ask you, what other sources, you mentioned one of the journalists in Pakistan, are there publications or journalists or books that you might recommend for folks that are interested in some of these issues we've talked about today?
Yeah, there's some great books on Pakistan, and some great journalists at the Times and the Post over the years who have engaged on the country. And of course, now I'm going to blank on names since you put me on the spot, Derek. But Steve Pohl's book is quite good. Yeah, please contact me separately, and I can give you some recommendations. They're also heavily evidenced in my footnotes, but Ambassador Hussein Haqqani's books are always interesting. He was ambassador for Pakistan around in Washington 2010 or 11. He certainly ran afoul of the military establishment and probably can't go back, but he's written some very insightful books about the country.
Yeah. Well, it's a good recommendation on Steve Pohl too. I just Googled him quickly and saw several things come up, so encourage people to check him out as well. Anything else you wanted to mention before we close out here, Ted?
No, the only thing I'll mention, and this goes to you too, Derek, is I mentioned in the book in a couple places that, it's a privilege to serve in the U.S. foreign policy community, despite the criticism that a lot of folks in government come into, usually just accepting the uniformed military. I found amazing dedication to protecting U.S. citizens overseas, some hostage cases that are discussed in the book where we really, the embassy was all out and all in on finding solutions to protect those Americans. In many other ways, protecting or supporting U.S. trade and investment. I know something you were engaged with, Derek, and supporting U.S. security interests in the region. I'm always impressed by the dedication of people of all ages I've seen in U.S. foreign policy, including those working in the non-governmental sector. And I hope if any students are among those participants, that they'll consider a career of service, whether through government, through non-government organizations, through the military, through international entities. There's a lot of opportunities out there to do good work still, despite the very challenging nature of some of the foreign policy problems that I know you guys are focused on with the organization. So it's been a privilege, and I'm happy to continue doing it, and also happy to bilaterally answer anyone's questions about a career in the state or beyond.
Well, thanks so much, Ted, and feel free to reach out to us at World Oregon, and we can put you in touch with Ted if you have follow-up questions. And for those of us who joined us today through the World Affairs Councils of America Network, zooming in from around the country, it's wonderful to have you join us as well. And if you haven't yet listened to it, I'm going to put in one more sort of other source that you might want to listen to is the Serial podcast. Most famous for their True Crime Season 1. Season 2 was all about Afghanistan, excuse me, and this current season is all about Guantanamo. And they really do some amazing reporting. It's not easy to listen to, but it is definitely worth the time. And so I'd encourage people who want to hear different aspects of it to listen, in particular to Season 2 in Afghanistan and the current one at Gitmo. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Thanks for your support of World Oregon. Ted, thank you for taking time in between posts to join us here today. And I look forward to seeing you again when our paths cross in Washington, D.C.
I hope they will soon. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Thank you, Derek. It's been great.
Thanks so much.